Africa cannot continue to pay for a crisis she did not create. We demand fairness, not charity.
Until now, the 54 African member countries of the United Nations have been blamed for actions they never committed. Their leaders were called to attend the United Nations General Assembly sessions, where they mostly spoke what the West wanted. African countries were then lectured on how they should work and improve, with the West appearing as neocolonialists who get the right to dictate to Africa what it should do. African countries have been blamed for insurgencies, instability, poverty, and environmental degradation, forgetting the fact that all this is due to colonialism and neocolonialism. Yet African leaders remained silent and humble, not speaking against the Western leaders. But it's enough now. Just recently, the South African and Ghanaian presidents spoke like never before, embarrassing the West. Pointing at blame shifting, they said forbidden things, making Western leaders at the General Assembly hide behind tables and hide their faces. But what did they say? Welcome to a new episode of Black Afric Diary, a channel where we talk about Black African history, culture, arts, and civilization. It's a place where you will see the real picture of Black Africa, its stories, and the events defining it. In this episode, let's know how the South African and Ghanaian presidents shook the United Nations. Let's get started. First, Ghanaian President Nana Addo Dankwa Akufo-Addo took the floor of the United Nations General Assembly and delivered a compelling argument that took the Western leaders by surprise. He made it clear that Africa should not be held accountable for global crises that were created elsewhere, and that the continent should not bear the brunt of their consequences. President Akufo-Addo began by making it clear that many of the crises Africa faces today, which are climate change, inequality, and governance, are not of Africa's making. He asserted that Africa cannot be blamed for these global challenges, which are largely the result of decisions and actions by wealthier, more industrialized nations. However, despite this, it is Africa that often faces the most severe consequences. This imbalance, he argued, is deeply unfair and must be addressed.
Africa, whilst contributing the least to global emissions, bears the heaviest burden. From floods to desertification, we're already experiencing its devastating effects. Despite the promises, the vulnerable remain abandoned. We're told to adapt and be resilient. But how does one adapt to famine or build resilience when farmers cannot predict the seasons? Africa cannot continue to pay for a crisis she did not create. We demand fairness, not charity.
Akufo-Addo specifically highlighted the devastating impact of climate change on Africa. While the continent contributes the least to global carbon emissions, it endures the harshest consequences, such as severe droughts, unpredictable weather patterns, and frequent floods. These climate disruptions have a particularly devastating effect on African farmers, who can no longer predict the seasons, leading to food insecurity and famine. However, instead of confessing to this, the West tries to use these crises as a form of mismanagement of African leaders. They try to strengthen their propaganda that Africa is facing crises because of its own deeds, cleverly changing the colonial history, which is to be blamed. For decades, Western leaders have frequently offered advice to Africa on how to overcome poverty and manage its economy, focusing on governance, democracy, and economic growth. However, this argument is fundamentally flawed because it overlooks the devastating legacy of colonialism and neocolonialism, both of which were driven by Western powers and continue to shape Africa's present-day challenges. Colonialism in Africa was marked by extreme exploitation that lasted for over a century. European powers, including Britain, France, Belgium, and others, systematically extracted Africa's natural wealth, gold, diamonds, rubber, timber, and agricultural produce, using forced labor and slavery to build their empires. For instance, Belgium's exploitation of the Congo and Britain's domination of resources in countries like Nigeria, Kenya, and Egypt led to unimaginable suffering for local populations. The scale of wealth looted from Africa can be understood by knowing the numbers. Europe colonized Africa for almost a century, and only 1 year of natural resource production in Africa is worth $406 billion, as of 2019 stats. Therefore, all the wealth Europe today possesses is actually driven from Africa. Traditional governance systems were destroyed, local economies were restructured to suit European interests, and cultural identities were suppressed. The colonial powers justified their exploitation through the pretense of a civilizing mission. But in reality, Africa's wealth fueled the industrial and economic growth of Europe. By the time many African nations gained independence in the mid-20th century, they were left impoverished and underdeveloped. The colonial economic model left African countries reliant on the export of raw materials, ensuring that wealth continued to flow out of Africa and into Europe, further entrenching poverty across the continent. After gaining political independence, African nations still found themselves under Western economic control. Neocolonialism, the modern form of economic and political influence over post-colonial nations, perpetuated this dynamic. While African countries might be free in name, their economies remained dependent on Western powers and institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. The West continues to exploit Africa's resources through unfair trade practices and multinational corporations that dominate industries such as mining, oil, and agriculture. In countries like Nigeria, multinational oil companies extract vast amounts of oil, but the majority of the profits are funneled back to Western nations. Similarly, in countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo, Western corporations control the diamond industry, while local populations see minimal benefits. This ongoing exploitation keeps African nations poor and dependent, as their resources are once again used to enrich Western economies. Given this history, it is hypocritical for Western leaders to lecture Africa on escaping poverty, especially when so many of Africa's challenges stem from Western exploitation. European and North American countries became wealthy in part by looting Africa's natural resources, and now they impose their models of democracy, governance, and economic growth as solutions to Africa's struggles. Yet these models are often disconnected from African realities and fail to address the structural inequalities left behind by colonialism. Therefore, the Ghanaian president said that the current system has failed and should be changed.
Current form, the Council does not reflect the realities of today's world. It remains an outdated post-Second World War relic, with Africa, a continent of 1.4 billion people, grossly underrepresented. We cannot speak of multilateralism when the structures of global governance are rooted in an unjust and unequal order. Mr. President, the time for half measures is over. Bold reforms are needed to ensure that every nation, large or small, rich or poor, has an equal voice at the table. Only then can we achieve a fair and inclusive system of governance.
Moreover, the West has never endured the kind of systematic resource theft, forced labor, and economic underdevelopment that Africa faced during colonialism. Western countries developed their economies and industries without the interference or exploitation that African nations had to endure. Before we continue further, tell us, are you enjoying the video? If yes, please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black Africa. Let's continue now. Given this historical context, it is inappropriate for Western nations to lecture Africa on economic or political development without acknowledging the long-lasting damage they have caused. And the global system, which the West does not want to change, actually ignores this fact. Therefore, a major focus of Akufo-Addo's speech was the need for reform in global governance structures, particularly the United Nations Security Council. He described the Council as a relic of the post-World War II era, one that fails to reflect the realities of today's world. Africa, with its population of 1.4 billion people, remains grossly underrepresented in the Council, a body tasked with maintaining international peace and security. A few countries get the power of veto, which is against the global democratic norms. Akufo-Addo argued that it is unjust to speak of multilateralism when a continent as significant as Africa is excluded from critical global decision-making processes. He called for bold reforms to ensure that every nation, regardless of size or wealth, has an equal voice at the table.
History will judge us, not by our words, but by our actions. The world is watching. The future is watching. We cannot be the generation that stood by as the world burned, whilst inequality widened and promises of justice went unfulfilled. That is why Ghana supports fully the Global Pact of the Future and its supporting documents.
Akufo-Addo also turned his attention to the deep economic inequality that exists between nations, a problem that has only been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. While the wealth of the richest individuals surged during the pandemic, millions of Africans were plunged further into poverty. He described this growing divide as both unsustainable and immoral, criticizing a global economic system that benefits a small elite at the expense of the majority. The president pointed out that over 700 million people worldwide still live in extreme poverty, with Africa shouldering a significant portion of this burden. He called for a new, fairer global economic order, one that promotes inclusivity and ensures that no nation, especially those in Africa, is left behind. Then the South African president stepped up to offer a real global governance structure, where countries are equal, not like the system where powerful countries can do whatever they want. In his speech to the United Nations, South African President Cyril Ramaphosa presented a powerful call for global cooperation and reform, emphasizing the pressing need to address worldwide crises and systemic inequalities. His speech centered around the Pact for the Future, a multilateral initiative designed to tackle global issues like conflict, climate change, inequality, and economic development, with a particular focus on Africa. Ramaphosa opened by acknowledging the multitude of crises the world is currently facing: wars, ongoing conflicts, and growing global tensions.
Wars, conflict, and the specter of emerging conflicts are ever persistent and present features of our time. Climate change and public health challenges are not only an existential threat, but they are also reversing economic growth and developmental gains in many parts of the world. There is widespread inequality, poverty, unemployment, deprivation, and destitution in many.
He linked these to deeper issues such as climate change and public health emergencies, which are not only threatening global security, but also undoing years of economic progress, especially in the Global South. He pointed out that while these challenges are global in nature, their impact is most severe in vulnerable regions, particularly in Africa. However, Africa's history, deeply shaped by colonialism, has left it more vulnerable to these global challenges. During the colonial era, European powers extracted vast resources from Africa, leaving behind poverty and underdevelopment. For example, South Africa's wealth was built on the backs of its gold and diamond industries, which enriched the colonial powers while leaving the local populations in poverty. Even today, the legacies of apartheid and colonialism contribute to wealth gaps and inequality across the continent. Ramaphosa's mention of poverty, inequality, and unemployment in Africa reflects the continued impact of these historical injustices. Then, Ramaphosa offered the Pact for the Future, which is an essential tool for addressing these global challenges, particularly for Africa. He stressed that the pact should help close the developmental divide that leaves many nations in the Global South, especially in Africa, lagging economically. He called for a significant overhaul of international financial institutions and the United Nations Security Council, which currently place decision-making power in the hands of a few powerful nations, while the rest of the world bears the brunt of global crises.
It is an opportunity also to make good on the promises to reform the global governance architecture, including the international finance institutions and the United Nations Security Council, placing the fate of the world's security in the hands of a select few when it is the vast majority of the peoples of the world who bear the brunt of the various threats is unjust, unfair, and unsustainable.
This call for reform is not new. After gaining independence, many African countries continued to face neocolonial pressures from Western-controlled global financial systems. For example, structural adjustment programs imposed by the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank often forced African nations to adopt austerity measures that stunted their economic growth, limiting public investment in healthcare, education, and infrastructure. Ramaphosa's demand for reform reflects Africa's long-standing demand for a more inclusive global governance structure, where African voices are not only heard, but also have the power to shape global decisions. For decades, African leaders have advocated for a permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council, reflecting Africa's population of over 1.4 billion people and its growing influence on the global stage. One of the central themes of Ramaphosa's address was the importance of aligning the Summit of the Future with Africa's Agenda 2063. This is the continent's strategic framework for transforming itself into a global powerhouse by 2063. It focuses on sustainable development, inclusive economic growth, and greater integration within the continent, with the ultimate goal of uplifting African nations out of poverty and fostering peace and stability.
We do believe that this is the time to recommit ourselves to adopting concrete actions, so we should leave this summit with a more ambitious, clearer, and concrete call to action to build a world for future generation that is far better for young people and for women than the world that we live in today. Our failure will in the end be a betrayal for future generations. And I do believe that we dare not fail. Action is what is required now.
Historically, African nations have been excluded from global economic discussions. The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, where European powers divided Africa for colonization, set the tone for centuries of economic exploitation and exclusion. Even in the post-colonial era, Africa has struggled to gain an equitable seat at the table in global governance structures. Ramaphosa's call for action is a continuation of Africa's long-standing demand for a say in shaping its own future and ensuring that its development agenda, such as Agenda 2063, is supported by the global community. In their recent speeches, South African President Cyril Ramaphosa and Ghanaian President Nana Addo Dankwa Akufo-Addo made it clear that Africa's engagement with the West has to change. No longer should African countries approach the global stage with requests or appeals. Instead, they should demand what rightfully belongs to the continent. This shift reflects a growing consensus that the colonial era, which saw Africa subordinated and exploited, is over. Now, African nations must assert their rightful place as equal players in global governance, economic development, and trade. On the economic front, both presidents have argued that Africa must redefine its relationship with the global economy. For too long, African countries have been positioned as mere suppliers of raw materials to the West, without the ability to fully benefit from their own resources. This arrangement has kept Africa dependent on Western markets, while preventing the continent from achieving true economic sovereignty. The shift from requesting aid to demanding equality is not just rhetorical, it is about changing how Africa is viewed and treated on the global stage. Ramaphosa and Akufo-Addo are working to shift the narrative, positioning Africa not as a continent in need, but as a powerful bloc that can drive global growth. Both leaders also made it clear that Africa should play a leading role in setting global agendas, especially in areas like climate change and economic development, which directly affect the continent. Instead of waiting for Western countries to set the terms, African nations are increasingly coming together to present unified demands. What do you think? Did these presidents do the right thing by explaining who really is to blame? Isn't it true that from now on, African leaders should be bold instead of silent whenever Africa is blamed? In the comment section right below, let us know which African leaders you think are the boldest ones, capable of handling the West. Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If yes, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We bring videos on Black Africa, its history, rich arts and culture, and things the world should know about. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.